Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And today we've seen All of Us Strangers. You've already seen this.
I saw it when the London Film Festival did a tour of part of the programme, and it played at the Mac.
Yeah. So the film came out in the summer in film festivals. It's been doing the rounds and it's now having a wide release.
Yes.
First time I've seen it, I was really looking forward to it. The trailer looked wonderful. What I would say straight away is it's almost a spoiler to actually say what the film is kind of fundamentally about, because the trailer doesn't really reveal it.
So we're spoiling.
I'd say before we spoil it, I would really recommend you see it, right? And I would recommend seeing it knowing as little as I did, which is, like, even from the trailer, the film it is kind of hiding the way it's telling its story, or the kind of story it's telling, because it looks like such a straightforward romance story from the trailer, and it's about a guy's isolation and a guy's history and a developing relationship with another man, and that's all there. But also, and here comes the spoiler, it's a ghost story, or at least it's a kind of ghost story. But there's also a number of ways in which you can interpret the reality of what's going on, and I think the film's quite deliberate about inviting that ambiguity, because it could be that the people with whom he's spending his time are real ghosts, quote unquote, like it's really supernatural, or it could be that it's all in his head. It could be some combination of the two, right?
Well, yes. I understood it to be about the ghosts that we all carry in us. Yeah.
Exactly.
Our histories, our unresolved issues, with family and time and place and conventions, and the regrets that we all have about kind of unresolved issues, and also I suppose kind of a longing to be loved or to be reassured about being loved. And
yeah. Absolutely. Do you remember what I was saying the other day about Argyle, which is that if you let a lot of things go, you'll have a much better time, and I was kind of saying that I think people taking the film too seriously in some ways, or kind of asking questions about what the reality is, might be kind of ruining the experience. I kind of feel the same way about this. So where the film is at its best for me is when it is at its freest, in terms of it's not inviting you to ask what is really happening, quote unquote. It's about the feeling of the moment. So when when Andrew Scott, who plays Adam, the main character, when he's with his parents, who are, his age, because they died when he was a youngster, but he's still seeing them and talking to them and so on. And he visits them at their home, and there's a combination of memory, of what they looked like and the house they lived in and what that all looked like, with the idea that they are also present now. So he comes out to his mother, and his mother is asking questions, and she's responding not as though he's 12 years old as he was when they died, but as an adult now. So like the kind of, it's not placing itself in the past. It's kind of bringing the parents into the modern day.
But it's also placing them in the past, because the mother's attitudes are all the attitudes of 1987.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm saying is, when the film is combining all of this so freely, it's really remarkable, and you can, if you want, ask questions of it, but I didn't. I was with it. It was contradictory, and it was interesting, and it was full of feeling. And throughout most of the film, I had such a positive, warm feeling to all of this. I thought, wow, this is really remarkable to do this, and it's amazing how well it gets away with some of what it's doing in that respect. And I think that towards the end of the film, it starts inviting you, or almost requiring you, to ask more serious questions about the quote-unquote reality of what it's showing you. And that, to me, is when it was at its weakest. And so it's funny that throughout the film, I had such a positive feeling towards everything that was going on. I thought, God, this is remarkable. And almost immediately upon leaving the cinema, I felt much more mixed about the whole experience.
Oh, that's interesting, because I don't. I mean, the first time I saw it, I was in floods throughout. Like, I completely kind of identify. I mean, I think it's a universal thing, but with a particular resonance to gay men of a particular age,
Yeah.
actually. Though I've been really befuddled by some people who are almost showing off their dislike for the film. And I just can't imagine that, really. And I don't know if it's just posturing or a reaction to, the great press that the film has received. It's kind of received like rave reviews. But, this feeling of regret, of sadness, of unresolved issues with parents and with your own past, things you could have done better, things that you could have been resolved. I do think that, at least for my generation of gay men, a certain kind of loneliness is built in. Yes. I mean, just because the place is so homophobic, the culture was so violently homophobic, right? And you get that in this film. He tells of, kind of being bullied and so on. And the father, knowing that he was kind of being bullied and saying, well, I would probably have bullied you too, right? So what I think of as this inbuilt loneliness is that whatever you're suffering, you can't talk to anyone about it. You have to live it through on your own, right? Yeah. So, and I think the film captures that, kind of in all kinds of ways. And then I think for me, the ending that, or the last bit, which you felt less comfortable with, for me is absolutely essential. And it's kind of almost, I mean, I think the film is great. I think it's a masterpiece. I think part of what makes it a masterpiece is that end, and it's not, I mean, so reality does intrude a bit, but I think, throughout the film, you've been concerned with his resolutions, with his past, with his parents, with whether he was loved, with, him needing their love and needing to feel that they loved him, which in fact all of the characters feel they need. And at the end, kind of what it brings is, you've been so concerned with yourself, but what about the other? Yeah, what about the people around you? Yeah, he's been completely oblivious to the other man's needs.
Harry.
Yeah, to his loneliness, to his kind of abandon. Yeah, he says something like, there's a line where he says, "There's sometimes you don't care about your future, you don't think you have a future, or you don't care what happens," or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the sense of, being there for others, being responsible for others being kind of, in a similar situation, but maybe more vulnerable than you because they're younger, or or because they're more in a drug culture, which is kind of a feature, of a certain aspect of gay life anyway. So it brings this thing back to him and his responsibility and his nurturing. And of course, he's too late, right? Like, so there's a tragic dimension, but it's almost like, the sense of at least helping through a certain kind of passage, which might only be in memory, kind of. But it brings up the question of the other, Yeah. So I like that very much, and I found it so moving.
I could tell you were moved.
Yeah.
It was interesting, and I felt moved too, although certainly not to the same extent. And I did find my feelings were kind of contradictory, because at the same time I was feeling moved by the genuine feeling of what was going on in these scenes, and at the same time I had a certain distance going, what is the truth of this? But only to a certain extent. And I found myself most moved, funnily enough, by the scene where he says goodbye to his parents, but not actually. I wasn't at my most moved in that scene. It was after it finished and he was on the train and in the lift home. I felt tears coming to my eyes. Like I don't know what it was about the ending of that scene, or it kind of the emotion continued to build up somehow after the scene had finished. So I did find it moving, and I do think it's the film looks so beautiful. It's graded and shot so beautifully. The way light kind of pours in to the flat, and it's rendered so rich. And those shots at the start of such a deep blue sky that you see, and then when he's the two of them are in bed together, and you've got this kind of like sunset type light pouring on their face. It's astonishing to look at. Really, really amazing.
I think it's a real masterpiece because the way that it moves through, I don't know, states of consciousness, or what could be external reality, what could be a conversation with the past, like you said, what could be a ghost story, but in a way where it doesn't matter, where like the focus is really on kind of evoking a certain kind of feeling, and a certain kind of struggle to resolve the past, or not to resolve it, but to kind of have a conversation with it, with who you were, what your parents were, what they would think of you now. There's also a line where he's now older than his father, right? Yeah, so kind of these things that you might hold them responsible for, or blame them for. But here, this is your situation now, and you're much older, and kind of, in some ways, you're in worse shape, or you're making more mistakes, or, So I really kind of, I just, the way that it weaves through, the way that music is deployed, the way that sense of it, not alienation, it's loneliness. So it's not.
Yeah, it's isolation.
It's kind of.
I mean, the idea of him at the start of the film in that huge tower block, and it's just him and Harry living in two separate flats. So you get a sense of isolation right at the start of just him on his own, but then it's the thing about the fire alarm going off, the building being evacuated, but he's the only one evacuating, and that's such a weird thing to look at. It's such a weird image and a weird feeling. You go, all of a sudden, what's going on here? And then you get this dialogue that explains, we're the only two people in this building, and so it made clear to the audience that that's why no one else is leaving the building. But it's that's only explaining what the reality of. You've got this extremely weird image of a building that you assumed would be full of people evacuating, and there's no one. It's just you, and that feeling of isolation that in the middle of a city, in the middle of a giant building that's got it's full of flats, you're the only one there.
I loved all of that, but also the film kind of creates these parallels. Right? So his parents are in 1987 and have 1987 attitudes and so on. The Paul Mescal character, who was meant to be 20 years younger, right? And they have this whole discussion whether they consider themselves queer or gay, and queer for one generation has connotations, gay for another generation has other connotations. But what was interesting was that the younger man also felt that even though he was out to his parents and his family and they'd been accepting and so on, that nonetheless he was edged out of the family. Kind of, and not out of any meanness or anything, but just, his brothers get married, they have children, they have kind of like a more natural fit. And all of a sudden, he doesn't kind of fit into, that kind of discussion really, or structure, so there's this unconscious kind of edging out, even when there is a coming out and an acceptance. So this loneliness that the characters share is not like an individual failure, right, or kind of an inability to connect. It's really the result of kind of all of these social structures at play, right? I'm sure as well as kind of individual responses to them. But I thought that was so beautifully handled. It had such resonance for me.
Yes, I can imagine. I've got so many sort of older gay friends online through you, basically, that so many of the conversations in this film so evoked the kind of things that you guys talk about, and the way you remember your histories and so on. And you talk about having grown up in the past and your experiences, and it felt incredibly honest. And it could have got to sort of, it could have had like an overly intellectual sort of thing of like having a debate almost in the film about one thing versus the other, but it doesn't do that. I'm thinking particularly about the scene in which Adam comes out to his mother, you know, which we've mentioned, and how she has these certain attitudes, but it's not like a dialectic. You know, it's not like I think one thing and I think the other and let's have a discussion. What she thinks is contradictory. You know, so she cares for him. She's kind of disappointed in him. She worries for him. She has a certain homophobia.
For sure.
You know, and all these things kind of play together. And it's, in some ways they complement each other, in some ways they're contradictory with each other. And it just feels like such a natural scene, you know. I mean, I thought that was such a remarkable scene because it's, like I said, it's not the film hosting a debate. It's the film expressing the feelings of a character. And that's where also I start to, you know, you kind of question how much of this is kind of in Adam's imagination or how much of it is kind of real and external to him, because what's interesting is that he doesn't always get answers that he wants from his parents. You know what I mean? It's like he would, or you could imagine that he would, if it's just about fantasy and about him imagining reconciliation and openness and so on. You know, but he doesn't always get what he wants, and you could, like, so much of what the mother's response is not the ideal response that you would want, and that's
no, it really is the response of that period. I mean, I think it's kind of solved a little bit because it's clear she loves her son, right? But it's also clear that she's got all of the prejudices of 1987, which, you know, were even worse prejudices than in 1977, right? Because, you know, that was the era of AIDS, and you know, I thought there was this moment, kind of slightly, again, sad, but also a little bit chilling, when, you know, she makes his favorite dish. I forget what it is, flapjacks or something. And then, you know, she says, take them with you because I won't be eating them.
Yes.
Right? It's almost like sharing food with him. Yeah, it's like contaminated, possibly AIDS.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. I mean, I didn't take the line specifically in that way, although I think you certainly could. I took it as she's just learned this information that she's not thoroughly happy with, and what was a lovely gesture to her son becomes a dismissive, you know, I don't want this anymore. It's you.
It could be that way, but I read it, you know,
yeah,
because she does kind of bring up AIDS, right? And it was,
yeah, absolutely,
you know, at its peak then, and, you know, Section 28 and all the advertisements on the tube, you know.
And people were also enormously misinformed and didn't know, like, that's a famous thing about Princess Diana shaking hands with HIV
That's right.
positive people.
You know,
and, like, you can touch someone who has HIV and not catch it.
That's right.
People didn't know. You know.
No. And you know, people were dying like fleas. So there was no combination therapy. There was nothing, you know, to help. So I read it that way.
Yeah. No, fair enough.
I found the Paul Mescal character so touching. I mean, you know, the shirt that he's wearing, which is so tacky. Yeah, like, you know, it reminds me a little bit of those velvet paintings, those that people used to put on their walls. Or, you know, a certain type of person. Yeah, so it's a really kind of tacky T-shirt with a deer and the forest, and but a kind of slightly glittery and so on, you know. So to me, it had like these connotations of like, you know, a kind of a low-class person, right? Though, of course, that was contradicted a little bit because, you know, he was then reading Walton, right? He was reading Thoreau in another scene, and he lives in this place. But, yeah, kind of, you know, the clothing and so on, to me, had kind of, you know, particular connotations. I could be wrong. Maybe it's a really famous designer that I just don't know.
Yeah. But, of course, the thing is he also lived in this place. You know, this kind of reveal at the end is that he has been dead the whole time, and that the relationship that we've seen develop with Adam is the relationship of a ghost with him. You know, there's that line about having closed the door on him, and that was it. So the implication being, we never met.
I'm a little bit confused about it because, you know, I do think that the trip to the Royal Vauxhall Tavern to me seemed real.
I think the film's implication is that none of that happened. He closed the door on him, and they never made this connection. And that's why he's been dead for days. I mean, there's the thing. He goes to his flat and he sees the empty bottle, which is the bottle that he brought that night. The implication being he finished it off that night. He overdosed.
You might be right. Yes.
I think that's what the film is reasonably clearly saying, which I suppose is one of the things that I found ultimately disappointing or off-putting about the end, because this relationship that we've seen develop was the one thing that you kind of really relied on being real in the film. Like all of these kind of imaginative, kind of flights of fancy or dreams or hallucinations or whatever they were with the parents were clearly, of that nature. But you came back to the relationship with Harry and it seemed real. Yeah. And the film removes that from you at the end. That wasn't even... Well, I mean, again, if he's a ghost and ghosts exist in the reality of this film, then it was real, but in a different way than we thought.
I'll have to look at the film again because, my impression was that they did have the one date, yeah. How that ties in with the bottle at the door, I'm not sure at the moment. But that, my reading of the film, having seen it twice, was that both times, that the Royal Valhall Tavern happened in the real world, and which kind of makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the conversations about the drugs, the difference in the drugs that they were taking, the kind of the being ill, the sharing of the being scared, So, I mean, obviously finding the bottle at the door then is a thing, right? Because that is the bottle that was introduced at the beginning, but kind of there's nothing to indicate that bottle couldn't have been drunk or whatever at a different date, at a different time.
Of course.
I think the
but
film...
Isn't it also true that he never changes his clothes? That's why you're picking up on that shirt. And I think the idea might be, this kind of these... He dies and he is at his last moment in kind of isolation. But, he never... I mean, it wouldn't be totally true. I think the parents are always in different clothes, so there's that. But that's the way I took Harry, at least.
Yeah.
But then the other thing is you do still get a kind of... Well, it's a bittersweet ending, but there's some beauty to it with this thing of going to bed with the ghost and lying together and fading into this dot which becomes a star in the sky, and we see lots of others, and there's a kind of combination of a feeling of isolation, just being a tiny little dot in the sky, but there are many others around, so you're kind of like everyone's isolated but all together, you know what I mean? It's kind of it's a really interesting image to finish the film on.
I loved Andrew Scott, just like his face, like when he would get emotional, it's so interesting because it's almost like he doesn't do anything except like the face transforms, so it gets red, or the eyes get moist or something, so interesting, for example, in contrast to Bradley Cooper in Maestro, where you're having all these flutterings and gestures and eye movements and voice changes, and he kind of doesn't seem to do anything except you feel like kind of the channel of emotion in his face. It's kind of, and that's like through tiny gradations of the face begins to be a little bit red, or the eyes begin to get a little bit moist. I thought I was so moved by his performance, really. Yeah,
he's really remarkable, and the same thing goes for Paul Mescal.
Paul Mescal's wonderful.
There's that wonderful shot where I think it's where he's talking about how his parents died and the experience of looking for the eye on the ground and stuff, and it's kind of it's sad and it's funny and all the rest. And Paul Mescal's eyes are just welling up, and they're red and he exudes so much sympathy.
I think all of them were, actually, because I think Claire Foy is fantastic, and Jamie Bell, whom I normally don't like, I think is fantastic in this. I think the whole introduction where you think it might be Andrew Scott cruising, somebody else
on the heath,
and he looks
the moustache.
Yeah, he looks like a clone of well, maybe the previous era to that one. And then you realize it's a father, and you really get a sense of low middle class kind of attitudes of the era. And then there's that moment where he says, "I love you, son," at the end. And that, again, is one of those moments where, kind of, it's just the eyes welling up and, kind of, he's not doing anything except kind of giving the impression of being. And I found that really beautiful.
Yes. Although I'd say the line I liked the most from him in that respect was when he says, "I'm sorry I never came in your room." So you were crying, which is a line from the trailer, in fact. And
that was lovely.
It works so beautifully, and that's when they're in the middle of the scene where Adam has come out to his mother, and his mother has informed his father that he's gay, and so now they're having their first discussion about him being gay and the childhood memories and so on. And it's a conversation which is similar to the one with the mother. It's kind of contradictory, and it's open, and it moves naturally, and it's funny at points. They remember I really love the line where he says, "I have good memories too." Like, great. Of course he does. He loved his parents still, and they had a good time. It's not like the fact that he was closeted and bullied and all this, even by his parents to some extent. Not bullied by his dad, but he didn't have an open relationship with him. Is like not the defining feature of his childhood, and he'll remember nice things as well. And it just builds so beautifully and naturally to the point where the father slightly breaks down and then says, "I'm sorry I never came in your room when you were crying." It's just beautiful. There's also an interesting line from the mother when he comes out to her, where she says, "You don't look gay," or something along those lines. And and again, that just it's a funny line, and people in the audience laughed, but it connotes this whole idea of what a gay person looks like, how they act, and that they don't have to be the stereotype or camp or whatever, which obviously they can be. But
her idea is, are you being served? Basically.
Yes, exactly. And the film, as you sort of suggested, is also to some extent playing on that with those opening images of what looks like cruising. The film is definitely inviting you to see it that way until it's revealed that it's not. It's interesting. I also want to think about the sound a little bit, and it actually really reminded me at points of The Zone of Interest. Because there's this thing about how quiet the building is, and Harry says, he hates how silent it is. In fact, he stops conversation at one point to point out that there's silence, and he says, "I have this white noise machine because I can't stand it." And I was talking to my brother just recently about The Zone of Interest, and he had a really interesting take on the end of it. So this is, I suppose, a minor spoiler for The Zone of Interest, but so there's that thing about right at the very end of The Zone of Interest, Rudolf Hoss effectively imagines the future, the legacy of Auschwitz, and he retches, and then you come back to him, and he has that kind of 1,000-yard stare sort of through the camera. And what my brother pointed out was that there's no sound at that point; it drops out. And we were talking about in the podcast how there's that underlying sound throughout The Zone of Interest of the sound of Auschwitz and the constant noise, and you only get silence when they're not in Auschwitz. And I didn't really know how to take the end. My brother had this really interesting read on it, which is that sound keeps everything from coming in, like mentally, and the moment at which there is finally silence in the film is in those corridors when there's no one around, there's no noise, there's absolutely nothing, and that's when all of a sudden the reality and the legacy, all that kind of idea of what he's doing and what they're doing floods in, and that's why he has this physical reaction to it, And I thought that's so interesting, and because it really made me think, like, there's so often a similar kind of low-lying sound going on under this, although it's for much different kind of purposes. But I really noticed when they're first together in the flat and they're first making out, and there is, I can't remember what kind of sound it is, but it's like a hum maybe, and it drops out conspicuously. Then Paul Mescal says, "How about I kiss you?" And then you go into this beautiful scene with the cameras kind of panning up and down their bodies, and like the so it's not the same thing in terms of like things rush in and overwhelm you, but the sound dropping out so intensifies that moment.
Yes.
It's so important to it.
I thought that there was a little bit that also with the conversation with the father. The sound seemed to drop off.
Yeah, I think you may be right. Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Whereas, like, in the lift, on the street, it, like, you do get, like, I don't know, industrial sounds or sounds of the night. Or it is kind of busy with sound in the background somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a similar kind of thing, like that kind of like continuous sound. Yeah, it does have the thing, stopping things. That's certainly the implication you get from Harry's take on it. He doesn't like the lack of noise, and there's a sense in which I can't be alone with my own thoughts, my own isolation. It's not something you get from Andrew Scott, but it's certainly pointed out from Harry. I thought it was interesting. I thought the sound design generally was really striking. It's so rich and flow, and actually I was thinking about flow as well, in terms of the structure of the film, because, and I'm not necessarily talking about overall structure, but there are times when I'm watching it going, how did we get here? There's such a freedom with which the film moves from scene to scene. I can't tell you that I remember what a transition in the film looks like. You just wind up in places. Yes. You wind up somewhere else.
Yes.
It's remarkable actually how it flows from scene to scene.
Yeah. Clearly, memory, the unconscious. I think a large kind of motivator is the protagonist is writing a screenplay based on 1987, called 1987, which involves his family somehow. Yeah, so that is there, not as a motor, but almost as a background rationale. Yeah, that kind of, So that is an all-around kind of motivator, maybe, to him going into his mind, him going into his past. Yeah. So so that freedom that you're talking about, the movement from one thing to another, I didn't even look for a motivator. Right? Like you just let yourself go with it.
Yeah. Well, it's not about like looking for a motivator, but it's just it's noticing that you're in a scene and going, wait, how did I even get here? Like, remember, there's that thing in Inception about how in a dream you always wind up in the middle of the dream, you can't remember how you got to it, and then that's so often actually how things in Inception work. And that's one of the things about, we just we came through we actually don't remember how a scene started. But I suppose that's true, that's probably true of a lot of films, really. You think about how a scene started, you probably can't, but there's something
of course it's true of all films.
I really noticed that here. I suppose it's probably also because the film was engaging with a type of storytelling that I hadn't imagined it would. So, like I say, from the trailer, from what I knew, or from what I felt I'd been told, there was no indication that this would be anything other than a perfectly ordinary film about real people in real life doing real things. And the fact that it is clearly doing something different from a pretty early point maybe encouraged me to notice how things were odd in other ways.
I thought it was interesting how similar it is to what's the other film with Paul Mescal?
After Sun?
After Sun.
Which I haven't seen.
Yeah. Okay, well, in that case we won't discuss it.
You can say what you want.
Well, I thought it was similar in After Sun because, there is that flight of consciousness of the past, of, what happened to characters, of, speaking to the past, if not to ghosts. Yeah, it's also a kind of a non-traditional narrative. Yeah, it is kind of, I suppose, quite arty in construction. So it asks of the audience to give themselves to that. Yeah, kind of, it's not going to follow traditional expectations of scene construction or kind of unity of time, space, action.
Yeah.
Right. So that's obviously part of what makes it kind of innovative and great. But actually, I thought it's interesting that it has that in common with Charlotte Church. Is it Charlotte Church?
No, Charlotte Church is
Charlotte Croft.
Charlotte Wells.
Wells, okay.
Yeah.
So neither could, yeah. So Charlotte Wells is After Sun, which I think is also like a truly great film.
Let's talk about that thing just quickly about, you were mentioning at the start people kind of posturing against this film.
Yes.
You know, when you said that, I was immediately reminded of Call Me By Your Name, which I think... Do you see a similarity in the way people are taking against it?
Yes, I mean, I do think... I do think that people took against Call Me By Your Name in the most unreasonable ways, really. In ways that I don't understand, and that actually I kind of don't respect, really. All these people kind of making fun of Timothée Chalamet, who I think is fantastic in that movie, and who's proved to be so good in so many different things since, right? And then you think, oh, who the fuck are you, really, to, and on the other hand, you think, oh, well, kind of, might make their little egos.
But there was a class element to it, right?
There is also a class element. There is kind of, a resentment of what is perceived to be Chalamet's upper middle class background, his mixed parentage, his arty bohemian, desires.
But the film setting and all that was, it was set in kind of upper middle class. These people with like this wonderful home in Italy and so on.
Well, that's
something people
so that is also true. I think there are two. I mean, some people who hated it for the depiction of the sexuality, or the lack of a depiction of it. Other people hated it because Chalamet in the film speaks 5 languages, has wonderful parents, and which again, kind of, get over it. I mean, really, I think it's a kind of a British disease, that kind of and a dehumanizing thing, really, which I think people must stop. I mean, one thing is to offer a class analysis, of course, yeah, but another thing is this knee-jerk despising of people that is so dehumanizing of those people, right? And I really kind of despise it with the full force of the term. I do despise it. So it's not just that it makes me uncomfortable, whatever. No. I hate them for doing it.
When we saw the Holdovers,
I think it doesn't speak very highly of them.
Yeah,
as people. When
we saw the Holdovers the other day, you said it's a film about how rich people can have problems too, and so...
Well, yeah, kind of. That is also true, but I don't think I'm doing the same thing.
No,
no, I don't think it's kind of like a knee-jerk reaction against rich people, crying out loud. But I do think that there is, about the Holdovers, I do think that there is something kind of very discomforting, to kind of be focusing on the problems of young people and to be focusing it on the most privileged people in society, really. But I think that's different. I think that is a class analysis as opposed to a knee-jerk response. I hate this rich kid. Because actually, that was not what the conversation was about.
No. I was thinking about that with regards to the Holdovers, actually, because I kind of thought one thing that I think really mitigates that is that for all this kid's privilege, the main kid that we see in the film, for all this kid's privilege, he's abandoned by his parents.
Yes.
Or not, well, he's not abandoned by his father. His father has mental issues and he wants to connect with him. He's abandoned by his mother, who's gone off with some other guy and leaves him at school. And that's the thing about boarding school to some extent as well, is you're sending your child off. That's gotta fucking hurt. I think that's maybe why, kind of that kind of Tory generation, the governmental generation. I'm not saying I really feel for them, but when you send your kid off to a boarding school and say, I'll meet you when you graduate, you fucking have your heart broken by your parents. They're broken people. And I kind of feel for that kid in that film because he's being abandoned by his parents at Christmas.
Yeah. Well,
so I think
I'm not that sympathetic.
I don't feel for his parents. I feel for him. He's a kid.
Yeah, I kind of...
Bit more generosity in your life. It's Christmas, Jose. Anyway, this film, maybe I'll go back and forth on All of Us Strangers, because like I say, throughout the film, my experience is one of really feeling everything that the film wants me to feel, although maybe not with the levels of intensity that it wants me to feel it. But I don't share so much of the backgrounds of these characters. I think it obviously speaks to someone who does much more strongly. But I really felt it, and I was really impressed with how it was moving and how it was kind of, you know, like I say, getting certain things past me that it otherwise might not, you know, that those kind of semi-dream ghost sequences. And then as soon as I come out of the film, maybe because the ending is this reveal of that so much of what you've seen is not what you thought, I suddenly started to feel more mixed. And then in conversation, the film is, you know, uplifted once again. So maybe I'll always sort of maybe be slightly going back and forth on it, but I think it's a really bold story to be telling. It's a really remarkable achievement.
It's very, very moving. So we recommend everyone see it. Thank you very much for listening. We are Eavesdropping at the Movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at Eavesdrop Movies, and Blue Sky, eavesdropping.bsky.social, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.